modifying cross members for floor pan change, which means, if you recall last week, we changed the bottom of the floor pan to make room for that converter. Because of the heat, it had to be a certain distance from the floor pan, so instead of moving the whole floor pan up, we just put a little clearance area like that, kind of like you call it a bump. But that then changed our floor pan, and our cross members make to the floor pan, and you know, they were welding, there's the weld surface right along the bottom of that, but it's not, it didn't adapt itself. We could have actually, I mean, there could have been ways to have it automatically update when we changed something in the floor pan. It could have automatically updated the cross members, but that would have took a lot of extra work, and it's pretty tricky to work with wavelengths and things like that. We've been working with wavelengths, but not that automated. So even though it could be done, it would have been a lot of extra work. So what we're gonna do is manually edit the two cross members, and I say two because they both are affected by that bump. The ones on the left side are not, so we don't have to worry about those, but the ones on the right, they are. Okay. And this is one of the, you know, like all of my projects, you could do the steps as it's spelled out, but it doesn't always do a great job of explaining why you're doing everything, so that's why I like to demonstrate it. So the first thing we do is, I need to figure out what is it that was new in this part that isn't reflected in those two other parts. And basically, everything I did last week, it was the clearance area, which was really 3 side walls and a top wall. Right? So the beginning of the exercise kind of has you try to figure out where that is. I mean, you could just, if you remember, because you just did it recently or it's your part, you could go through the tree and you could think, well, I know that's in the floor pan, that's somewhere. We made a thing called converter clearance geometry. I made a feature group with that name, and probably the last thing in that feature group, in fact, I named it exhaust clearance wall. It's that thing right there. Of course, that's a face blend. It's always a little bit misleading. Is it saying that's the exhaust clearance wall, just that ribbon around there? It really isn't. It was what was created by that face blend, right? And the best way to see that is just go back in time to that. Okay, and now I can see when we made exhaust clearance wall and I made that face blend, even though if I still pick it, it looks like it's just a fillet on the top, but the stuff in converter clearance geometry is represented by that whole thing, that whole chunk, okay? So that's what it said. Try to locate that. Now the way I did it, I went manually, but in the book it's basically saying, right, I mean in my instructions, it's basically saying you can actually click on that. You would have to know that that fillet was the last thing I did for the finished part I'm looking for, the finished feature I'm looking for. You know, so even that, would you know that? I don't know. You'd have to really pay attention to how did we make this thing? What was the last fillet I made? And it was that, before I added it to the rest of the part. That fillet right there at the bottom, that's when I added the converter clearance to the rest of the part. So that then, just deduction, my deduction is that was the last thing I did. I tell you can click on it, and it does highlight, it finds it in the tree for you, so there it is. Right? So that is what it looked like right before it got incorporated to everything else. Remember, you can also do this. This isn't in the instructions, but I'm just reminding you of this thing. You can go to Browse, and you can see right after the exhaust clearance wall, there was another face blend in the new final form before trim. And I did spell it wrong, and I left it spelled wrong. But so, you know, Browse is also a way of exploring things. Kind of like CATIA using parents and children. Okay? So what I want to do then is get a copy of that chunk, the 3 walls in the top, but it's washed out. It was consumed. So we're going to do our friend here, right click, go to extract body here. Okay? And that's an extracted body, and of course I do have you name it. I never remember if I have you name certain things because I don't do it for everything. And it's copy of exhaust clearance. Exhaust clearance. And because, I was talking about wavelengths, so we are gonna go into a different part, 2 different parts, and reference that thing. Again, we don't have to do this, but to make life a lot easier, visually and for other reasons, it's a good idea to rename the sheet body. Okay, that's this guy. So, well, that's a feature actually. You gotta be careful, because not to go off topic here, but when I hover over that, it kinda looks like you're hovering over a sheet body. But that's actually a feature called extracted body, and I already did name that. But that does have a sheet body underlying it. And again, as a reminder, I know I didn't rename the sheet body because it says sheet body of copy of exhaust clearance. And that's not all uppercase, that's mixed, right? Upper and lower, that's the name of the feature. But I'm on the, so it doesn't have its name yet, but if you go to properties like we talked about before, and I should have copied and pasted, but I forgot. I'll just call this copy of exhaust clearance. And it doesn't matter if it's upper or lowercase, because this is gonna make it uppercase. Turn on apply to work bar, hit OK, just to double check. Now, it doesn't say sheet body of, it says sheet body, and uppercase has got the name. It does say of later on. What is that a sheet body of? It's of the feature with the same name. Well, we talked about that a lot before, I just wanna bring it up again, okay? So we got that available now as its own feature that we can reference in the cross members to make changes to the cross members. Okay, and I'll start with the one in the front, maybe I'll hide those, hide the stuff in inputs. Now when I see other things like that, it's like, why do I still see those? I just hid the seat tracks and risers, right? Well, that probably means these are from the rear. So if I just temporarily hide that, then you won't see that stuff either. Not that you have to, but. So the trick now is, how do I incorporate that bump into this part? And even this could be done a few different ways. I played around with it, I tried it a couple different ways. The easiest way is what we're doing here, but I could somehow or other incorporate that bump, this thing. I mean, we have to bring a copy of it into this part file. I don't know if I did that yet. No, it's coming out. But I want to incorporate that. I could go to this thing before I did the blend to the weld flanges. Remember, there was the U-channel main form there, and then there was the weld flanges, which is that big trough looking thing. I could attach this, or I could incorporate this to either one of those, so that when they then came together to make this fillet here, that bump would have been included. The way we decide to do it is, let's take this chunk and put it in the weld flanges geometry. I'll show you what I mean. Just saying that doesn't explain very much, right? So in the instructions it says, well, let's find out where we were before I made this fillet, right? Did that face blend. That's called the final form before the trim, that face blend. If I click on it, it will show it to me here, okay? If I go back in time to it, make it current feature. That's it. That's the final form before the trim. I guess I could have said this earlier. So to let you know what I'm leading to with this little discussion here. What I decided to do, or what we decided to do, is take that bump and add it to the main slab on the bottom before it got blended to everything else. Okay. Right now, and it's sort of a history of how we made this part. We had an offset surface here that was actually from a wavelength surface on the rear tunnel. We had another one over here for the transition part of the tunnel, right? We wavelengthed the surface from the floor pan, offset it by the material thickness. Did the same thing here. Blended those together here. We did something over here with the sill weld flange. We also took the thing we've been using over and over again, the copy of the main slab on the bottom. We offset that up, and we blended all those things together for the weld flanges, right? And then we added that to this part. So again, I want to go back in time a little bit from this. So it says, find the final form before trim. I want to make sure I tell you to do what I'm doing. Okay, click on it, yep, do that. Oh, and it talks about what I was just saying, in the weld flanges group, right, we made wavelengths to those things. And now there's one, two, three, four things that we blended together. But I only see 3 linked bodies here. One is the rear tunnel surface, one's the transition, one's the sill weld flange. The reason I don't see 4 of them is because that was up, I think, under inputs maybe? Can't remember where, yeah. That's where we brought in a copy of horizontal set, because we use that for a few other things too. So I didn't put that in the same spot as these other 3 things came in. But then we offset them to account for the material thickness. So what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna treat this chunk, that thing down here, as if it's another one of the features that are gonna be put together for the weld flanges. So again, we have 4 things right now, right? Those 4. I'm gonna add another one to the list. So I wanna put it here in weld flanges, okay? So, it says, that's what it says in my instructions. The new clearance data will be added to this weld flange data. So the first thing is to get that chunk in here, because every time I keep showing it to you, that's still in the floor pan. I need a copy of it. It says activate the weld flanges feature group, because I want to put it in there as soon as I make the link to it. So I'll make this active. And then we're going to go to wave geometry linker. You go to assemblies, wave geometry linker. It says do it as a body. So I'm going to pick that. And right there, again, that's one reason we named the sheet body. Because it says sheet body in caps. Copy of exhaust clearance, that's what I want. If we didn't rename the sheet body, that would just say single body, sheet body in floor pan 01. It wouldn't tell you what it was. And I know I said this before too. That's not the only reason we rename it, but that's a good reason. It makes it a lot easier to find things. Okay, and I just hit okay. Made a link body, link copy of that. Well, again, that's from the floor pan. But the floor pan is the surface, and it's only the underside of the material. So where it really hits our cross member would be the other side of the material. So we're gonna offset that, like we've been doing. We're gonna offset this guy, make the body faces, and we're gonna use the floor pan thickness linked expression. Remember, we had a linked expression to the floor pan thickness. And I'm doing it right in the window in the instructions. It says to go to the expressions window and do it. You know, go over here and go to formula. But you can remember, you can do it right in here. You can go to floor pan thickness, and it's a little formula of +1. Because, yeah, we do want to offset it by the material because it's the other side of the material, but we also want a little clearance area when we incorporate this. So where the flange ultimately is going to come across here, where it comes up over here, it's not really going to touch. It's going to be a clearance. The parts get welded here and over here, but not right here. So it's gonna, right here and here, the offset's fine. But we're gonna also have a little bit of a clearance on this thing. That's why we added the +1, okay? So that offset, do I have you name it? Yeah, call it exhaust clearance offset. No, I don't have us rename the sheet body because we're not planning on using this to wavelength to something else. It's when you know something's gonna be wavelength to another part, that's when you gotta worry about the sheet body. Then it says, you know, we wanna organize this a little bit better, because I got the link bodies up here and then the offsets, but now I got a new couple of them down here. You can, because these are not linked to anything right here, I could take these two and put them in between. Now it's got 4 link bodies in a row, and the offset just added itself right there. We don't really need to see the link body anymore. So now we've got that, okay? And now, again, we're still kind of deciding here. We could have done it a couple different ways. Where do I want to incorporate that blend? I want it somehow in this whole thing called weld flanges, okay? Before the final form, before trimmed. So I could put it in right now. I could just put it at the bottom of this weld flanges group. But I don't know, for whatever reason, maybe just to add an extra level of excitement, I said, let's put it in before I even connected the bottom to the sides. So if you go back here, you can say, well, what was this face blend? Just go back in time. I mean, you don't have to do all this, but All right, so all those things that are blended together, that's when I put the two tunnel things together. Then what do? Then we added it to the bottom here, and from in my instructions it says, I want to put it on before we use the bottom, before we add it to this. So in other words, right before this fillet, this face blend, that's when I want to add that face blend. So in other words, we're going to say, I put those two walls together, then I put this chunk and the bottom together, then we put those together. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's what I decided. So that means go one step ahead of that guy. Where those two are together, pretty sure that's what I told you. Yeah. Now we're going to add another face blend. And you remember, I kind of been saying this all along. When you do a face blend, you know, try to make sure this is set to body faces, okay? So that when you pick something, and I'm going to pick this, do I tell you that? Yeah, it does say pick this first. It says create an 8mm face blend between the weld flange bottom offset. I don't know, but it's this guy. Oh yeah, I was supposed to name it. I didn't name it myself. But I did that little offset of that thing there. I was supposed to name that a while back, but it's right here. This is the offset, right? What was I saying? I lost my train of thought. Oh, pick this one first, okay? If you don't, it could cause issues. We can always fix it, but it could. Pick this one first because I'm making a face blend between this and this of 8mm, okay? The reason I say pick that one first is because now that made a whole new sheet body. And that entire sheet body, the system remembers what sheet body it was before. And this is going to be a little bit fuzzy. But if I go to the next face blend now, just make it the current feature, it worked okay. See how I said, okay, you got this face blend, and now that it was already there, but it wasn't active, so I just made it active again. And it picked it up okay. That last face blend over here, when I made this one, if I would have picked this first, and then that one, oh, you know what, it probably still would have worked because it was looking at whatever the sheet body was, all right? When you pick body faces, you're basically saying whatever makes up that body right now, remember that, even if you add things to it later or take things away from it. So really what would have mattered is this face blend that was already there, but I just, you know, I went back in time to make it there. When I go here, okay? If this was on body faces, then it wouldn't care that I changed this one. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense. When I made this blend right here, I'll try to explain it again. If it didn't make sense the first time, I don't know if it'll make sense the second time, but when I put these two together, okay, there was a face one and a face two, okay? When this face was picked, it was on body faces, okay? So that means, yeah, all right, we made this blend. Later on, if things ever change, if you do something to this body that changes it, but it's still part of the same body, it's gonna pick it up anyway, right? If it wasn't on body faces, if we had used some other ones like tangent or feature, whatever, sometimes you change something after the fact like we just did. And this blend then says, well, I'm not pointing to the same thing I was before. So, again, whether or not this really explains it or makes sense to you, body faces makes it much more forgiving. It just says, whatever you do to the stuff that we were pointing at before, we're still gonna see it. So it didn't hurt anything. Whether or not you got that, I already can see that it worked. In fact, to double check this, I'll just go all the way to the end of my history. And there it is, it picked it up. Everything after that still worked fine, and you see it gave me that little extra thing. I mean, I could work my way through the history. So the final form before the trim, that was when we took whatever we called the U-channel and added it to those bunch of weld flange surfaces. That's still good, right? Because all those fillets were done in the correct order, and we used body faces for them. Then we made the trim. I don't need to show all how that was created, but if I go back to that, the trim looked like that. That didn't change, that wasn't affected, okay? And then the last thing we did was the trim sheet between those two, and it worked fine. So it finished the part. So, without really talking about it as we were building it, that body faces rule, that's always a good thing. If you don't use body faces, you run the risk of sometimes having a part done, then you go back after the fact and make changes to some of the earlier geometry. And then when you update to the end again, some things fail. Now, if it did fail, because maybe that face blend, which one was it? That face blend that put those two together right there? Or not that one, that was when this face blend. If that one would have failed, you'd see a red and white X by it, and you could double click on it. You could double click on it, and you would see that one of the inputs was wrong. Right? I went, I keep bouncing in between the wrong one. This one, wasn't it that one? Whatever one it was, that one, okay. If it failed, you might go here, double click on it. I taught this in CATIA, I try to teach it here. When something fails, double click and see what it's trying to do. And you might see, this one might say, yeah, face one is good, it's orange. But for face two, it might say that there's something missing, it doesn't know what to pick. You could click here and physically pick the new thing that has been picked. Sometimes that would be all you needed to do, right? But if you did it right, you didn't even have to do that. You just went in and added a new blend into the history. And I guess I can say that since I'm talking about it, I like to hear myself talk. In NX, when you add a blend, you go back in time. I mean, the tree is all about the history. You went back in time, so I went back to this point in time. Right? And I added that. That automatically inserts it into the history. So whatever happened after that, it knows, well, there's a new operation in between us now. So if you had, step 2 and now you have step 3, if you go back to step 2 and add something in between there, that becomes a new step 3, and what was step 3 becomes step 4. In NX, that happens automatically in the history. Okay. Those of you remember from the CATIA GSD class, it doesn't. If you wanted to put something into the history and make sure it goes in between things, you had to do that insert mode in CATIA. I don't know if I'm confusing you by talking about it, but I like to relate the softwares to each other because they're very similar, but there's some differences, and that is one of the differences, right? The tree in NX is completely about the history, in CATIA it's not. So anyway, after wasting all that time talking about it, now it's never a waste, right? We do that, and then, it says here, okay, that's what it looks like. Then it says, if you go and look on the other side, the left side, it didn't affect it, but it's not supposed to affect it, so that's a good thing, right? But then it says, here's the last step. It's only 8 pages or 6 pages on this one. The last step basically says, repeat that whole process starting with step 5 on the rear right cross member. So I don't really have to demo it or anything. We have a copy of that chunk you made in the floor pan. You're gonna go into the rear front right cross member. You're gonna find the same spot you were, in the weld flanges. Find the blend that you wanted to go just before. Make that the work part, or make it active. Okay. Make the new blend between these the big slab on the bottom and that new clearance thing. And if you did it right and update, that part will look just fine too. So I won't even bother demoing it because it's the same steps I just showed you. Even though I know it's early and you guys want to be like, no, stay and talk more. I'm going to say no, I'm going to stop talking. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Carry on then. You have a question?
Yes, so you can answer from there. You need to stand up.
Okay.
So what